two boys and two girls. All of them are 17 years old, so they are on the cusp of adulthood.
Okay.
But each one, they all come from that same area, which is a very poor area of the capital city of Port Louis. And they feel that the future is close to them, that the future is non-existent. But each one has his strategy for either coping or not coping, but each one is telling the same story almost, but in a different voice. And Eve is the sort of fulcrum and the center of the novel, and everything happens around her. And she's the most mysterious of the lot because she surrounds herself with solitude. She's put an armor around herself so that she feels that even if men have her body, they're not touching the essence of herself. But in the end, I mean, she thinks she's a predator, but in the end you can see that she's actually, a victim of the circumstances and of other people, of other men. But so it's a tragic story, but at the same time it's very true. It's what's happening not only in Mauritius, but in many parts of the world with disenfranchised youth, the young people who feel that everybody has abandoned them, including their parents. So this was the real feeling behind this novel, talking about getting these young people to talk themselves, to talk in a language of their own sort of inner self, and sometimes they're subconscious or sometimes they're rebellion, but each is in their own voice that they speak.
I had a question about how you came to those characters. I wondered as I read it, as Eve is the center, you just said this, was she the first character that you defined and then came to the others, or was it this sort of organic? How did it come about?
Yeah.
How did you pick them?
Yeah, she was the first, and actually the name came first because I also write poetry, and sometimes poetry is a sort of writing with the unconscious or subconscious, if you like, not sort of intellectually thought or lucidly thought, but with sort of in touch with something else. And very often, just before falling asleep, sometimes fragments of poetry come to me at that time, and I think the next day I'm going to have to write this down and write a poem. But then one night I had this sort of phrase, an incomplete phrase in French, Ève de ses décombres, which means Eve out of her ruins, but the out is sort of not said, so it's Eve of her ruins, if you like. And I was thinking, well, tomorrow I'll probably write a poem with that fragment of sentence. And then the next day when I started, I had this image of a young girl in the ruins, walking at night and limping and wounded, and suddenly I started wondering, but who is this girl, who is this Eve, and what's happening to her, where is she going, where are these ruins from? And when you start asking questions like this, it's like sort of a novelistic writing that starts coming to the forefront, and you want to answer this question and get to that story. So she started out the story, and then I knew there would be people around her and her own peers, if you like, in age. And I sort of imagined Saad very early on as the sort of a sort of person who will look at her, but almost from outside, and with that poetry and that wanting to write about her, to see her from another point of view, apart from the other boys or the men of the area. But then the other two characters almost came without my expecting them. Like Clélio, I thought there will be one who's sort of rebelling against authority, but then his voice became so sort of strong and urgent that Clélio and Savita came afterwards, but then it became a sort of complete with those four characters. It's a sort of tentative way of going into a novel, which usually is good because you're not sure where you're going, and it's a voyage of discovery, like as you're writing.
And do you think that's why she kind of remains a bit of a mystery? Because even as the novel is constructed, we're hearing more about Eve than we are hearing her own voice, which is very, even when she speaks or narrates in the novel, it's very much an interior voice, not so much a spoken voice. Was that intentional, or did it just kind of?
Yeah, it was intentional because she's the one who's been, in a way, the most wounded from childhood onwards, and so she's set up these barriers around herself. So even when she's speaking in the novel, she's not really telling the truth in a way. She's constructing this image of herself as a hard person who can fight back. But then I needed also to have a voice talking about her as she really was. So that's why I had also passages in italics where you don't know who's speaking. It could be none of them, or maybe one of them, and that voice is actually every time telling her who she is really and what she's really feeling, and sort of explaining who she is a little bit more than she does herself. So in fact there are 5 voices in the novel.
I wonder now, I've read and heard about these things, you know, that people end up somewhere, okay, and they're in a country that isn't where they're from, so they're not just turned loose to integrate into the country and have the resources, and yet the country they came from, there just aren't the resources. Where do you think we need to go from here with this? It's you uncover it, and then the next really impulse from the audience would be, well, what do we do about this? There's always bringing food, and that just perpetuates everything. Then after a while, there might be 8 or 9 generations, and these people are still living this not quite human life. It's certainly not the advanced human life we have here in the West. But these things are in the third world, and the governments, the people in charge of these political territories, the countries and that they're in, just, they seem to be willing to let it go on. Have you've thought of a way out? You've thought of steps to ameliorate this?
Well, first of all, it's not completely only in the third world. It happens, you have disenfranchised people everywhere, even in what you call.
But to one degree or the other, that exists everywhere, true.
Yeah.
Just it's concentrated and institutionalized more in areas that don't have resources for their own people already. So you can kind of see where they're coming from, but at the same time, why don't they do something? But then if they did, where would it come from? It's kind of a knotty problem, really. There's so much that feeds into it.
Well, in Mauritius it's different because these people are not, everybody has immigrated there in the past 300 years, so there wasn't any sort of native people living there. So everybody came from somewhere else. So even when those people who are, but the people who are very poor are Mauritians. But they, of course, in that society, in every society, you have people who are very poor and others who are getting richer and richer. And these ones are the ones who are really being left behind by the sort of material economic development. So in a way, it's even worse maybe because, the authorities should be able to offer a level of development everywhere through education, through employment. So this is one of the things that I'm trying to sort of pinpoint, because Mauritius wants to give this image of a sort of tropical paradise and attract tourists and all that, but at the same time there are people that they're not seeing in their own society. But elsewhere, I think the current situation of refugees and migrants who are being pushed away from their own countries through wars and through a historical situation that is not of their own choosing. I think there's enough resources in the world to be able to accommodate people, to be able to help the children, to help those who are escaping a war zone. but we are becoming more and more closed in by our own needs, our own sort of, we feel that if somebody else is taking a little bit of our space, we are losing out, which is not necessarily the case.
The zero-sum model, that
yeah.
the pie is only this big,
Yeah.
and we can't let somebody come up and be giving them the prenatal nutrition or the education or something because they might not, as opposed to, well, there are some aspects of the advanced world, some models for ways of doing things that make the pie much, much bigger. You look at technology is really a bright spot, medical technology. My husband right now would totally not have been alive this last year and some if it weren't for like just tremendously advanced, the oncology and all that.
But also,
and things are available and technology is moving forward in such a way. There are ways of
definitely. And the pie is not that small. There's 1% of the world population that holds a huge part of the pie and doesn't want to.
It's
share
really the
it.
distribution.
Yeah, it's the distribution.
And the culture someone's brought up in, the education,
Yeah.
that in this country, we're born into the concept of you're going to go to school, that's it, you're not going to quit. I was told you're not going to quit after high school. We didn't have any money to speak of, but my mother insisted, so I stayed at home, I packed the lunch, I took the bus to U of H, we were in Houston, and that was the standard, and that's what's expected. But if you're born into a place where it doesn't enter your brain as inputs, well, you're going to stay in school, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. The human brain is so malleable, we're so plastic psychologically. If we had those expectations, I mean, in nutrition, obviously, and some access to education. And with computers, they're so cheap, everything can be replicated so cheaply now, really, and books and everything. It is a very novel problem.
It's all very possible, and it's very sad that it's not happening.
Yeah, it makes you think.
But the point, the beautiful point that Ananda is giving us in her novel is this. She's giving life to and character to a problem that we theoretically, in the abstract, know exists.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, after reading her novel, we know 4 people who are in that situation. And it's a very real situation.
Bringing it down
Yes. I'm sorry.
to the person.
Yeah, you mentioned the aspect of Mauritius being a tropical paradise, right? And I mean, I'm actually French, I'm from France, and it's true that in my experience, I thought, I haven't read your whole book, I've read the first 2 chapters at home actually, you guys lent me a copy. But I thought it was really interesting, to hear the other side of, life in Mauritius, because as a French person, I always heard I heard Mauritius in this kind of, exotic destination, and it was really
It's the
moving.
Caribbean,
Yeah.
it's the French Caribbean.
And up until
That's where you
recently,
go.
there was this article, I think, that was published online and in different newspapers about how, up until very recently, Mauritius was the destination for the elite in terms of vacation. So not everyone actually knew or had access to going and vacationing there. So this sort of like prestige
Well,
that
yeah,
they wanted to
because
cultivate.
it's
expensive.
it's expensive to get there.
Yeah.
I mean,
It
even from France, it's a long way. Yes.
So I wonder about that. Does the rest of your book deal with this kind of like the discrepancy between like this whole like, I know Yaz is really interested in this question, this whole like aspect of Mauritius being, this like tourism being so like developed, and then this population being kind of marginalized? Do they ever
Meet.
meet? Like, do the two different worlds ever intersect in the novel?
No, we stay with these four people, but what was interesting for me also is that Mauritius, as I said, it's made up of a lot of different groups and communities, and of religious groups, linguistic groups, of country of origin, etc., which are still very much used in terms of identities. People identify with that group. But in this novel, the four different characters are from different ethnic groups, but they're all from the same very poor area, and they all have the same problems to deal with. So what he's saying is that, it's a new identity. It's the identity of the poor and the sort of those who don't have anything. So, it's a way of also bringing to light that these identities are also completely a construct of the society, which doesn't mean anything. It only serves political purposes or fighting for resources and things like that. But and in so doing, they lose sight of first of all, what's rich about having such a mixed population, and also about those who really need to be helped and who don't have the avenues of help opening in front of them. And I think it's, as Joe was saying, that by being inside these characters, the reader has to, in a way, identify with them and sympathize with them and know from the inside what they're going through. So they can't sort of close their eyes afterwards and say, we didn't know about this, or, we can't see them, which some people in Mauritius have told me, we know these things are happening in front of us and next to us, and we don't see them.
Yeah.
But they choose not to see them.
Now, not to sell Ananda's other book, but Indian Tango does deal, it takes place in India, of course, and it deals a lot with the cross-section. It's a very, very heavily political novel, as well as very personal, and so the political, the male, the female, it all kind of combines in there. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, as I said. I really, really treasure people who translate this work, because French is just not mine. It's not happening. Thank you very much, Ananda. Thank you all for coming. Please enjoy cookies, and Ananda will sign books if you want her to.